Welcome everybody to another Lean BYTES. For those of you who are new to Lean BYTES, those of you who are external or just some new hires at LT, Lean BYTES is something we do every 2 weeks where somebody will talk for 16 minutes. So 16 minutes of bytes, haha, very funny. And just give a topic on, it might be a technical topic or social topic or anything like that. So if you're interested in giving a future presentation, just go ahead and reach out to either me, Tim Gifford, John Graf, Alex McClure, or post on the Lean BYTES channel internally as well. But today we've got John Graf and Alex McClure talking to us about you might need Docker if. So I'll go ahead and throw it over to them.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So we'll try to go through this pretty quickly with some high-level discussions about why you might want to use Docker and open it up hopefully for a couple questions at the end. So if we just kind of run through the agenda here, we're really looking to review some scenarios where incorporating Docker into your project could provide some efficiency or performance gains to your team or simplify your work process or workflow. So our goal is, I figure we'll run through like a high level understanding of what Docker is just to bring everybody up to speed for those who aren't familiar with it. We'll talk about when you should consider Docker because it's a tool just like anything else. And guess what? It's not a perfect fit for everything. And how it might simplify the development process and yeah, just kind of walk us through faster feedback cycles by using Docker locally. So super high level, what is Docker? Well, I like to think of it as a cousin to a virtual machine, and I'm sure there's those of you out there like Ethan who might disagree with me, but it's a similar concept, right? Where with a virtual machine, your child process is completely isolated from the host. The difference here with Docker is they actually share a portion of the kernel. So because of that, and they're both built off of this base image with certain things already pre-installed on them, we can actually spin up Docker a lot faster than our virtual machines. So there's a lot of performance considerations that we can take advantage of when using Docker. But for all intents and purposes, when we're thinking about it, easy way to think of it is it's like a similar concept to a virtual machine, right? And there's also some other benefits with Docker. We can compose them so that we can orchestrate the behavior or standing up multiple containers or networks. So we can use composition to our advantage to simplify our workflow even with that. All right.
So if you need a local database for testing your app, so a lot of times when we're running through these or running through multiple applications, especially as consultants, we'll need multiple versions of databases installed: MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, you name it.
Mongo,
right? So what this allows us to do is not have to necessarily do full installs of all those and keep those on our machine throughout the lifetime of our machine, because how many of us ever actually go clean those up? It also helps us with managing different versions. So if we're working on different projects, one version is running one version of MySQL versus an older version. It's going to help you with being able to go through and keep those versions separate without having to have installs. So another thing that we can do is like ephemerally build it, right? If we want to have data that is always pre-populated in our database, and then when we go through and want to make changes, we don't want to actually keep those. We have the ability to just blow that away and reset our database again when we restart our Docker instance.
Yeah, and I know I've run into instances where I've got my database in like kind of a weird state, and the nice thing about an ephemeral instance, I just throw it away, and I spin it up in a couple seconds.
Right. The other nice thing we can do is start sharing isolated testing data. And with that, when we want to build that database back up, we have a standard set of test data that we can share among the development team and be able to have that as a kind of common consideration. If we want to manipulate that more and add more to it, we just add more migrations into it.
Absolutely. Okay, so if you need a tool to migrate your database, you might need Docker. So like we talked about with ephemeral data, just to kind of build off of that concept, right? It makes it really easy to test and retest locally. And if we have set that up with like a migration tool, so some of you might be familiar with tools like Flyway, right? This is a great example. We can use it to regenerate on startup our database context or our schemas or our tables, right, that we're trying to set up and apply. So it makes it really easy. And like we talked about earlier about scripting this all out, right? Since it's orchestrated through like a Docker Compose potentially, we can script the creation out of the database, and we don't have to harm any like shared environments. I've worked at some client sites where they create a testing database environment, which is their golden sample database that no one's supposed to touch. And the problem is it's still shared and people still manipulate and mess up data. And so there's still no guarantee. But if we had some way to like tear down our database and script the recreation of it, it would simplify this whole process. And we could have maybe pushed this into some of the other categories, but I feel like this is such an important one to consider that we wanted to call it out separately.
All right, if you need to install numerous CLI tools, things like Terraform, Maven, Gradle, AWS CDK, even different programming languages like Python 2 versus Python 3, where you're going to have conflicts when they're installed. You can run all of this through Docker and specify that version without having to have those dependencies installed on your machine to really have to go back and argue about environment variables and all of that. So that isolation can be really, really handy if, again, working on multiple teams is a huge, huge instance for this, or working with legacy software versus new software that you're writing.
Right, or just trying to match your build environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you need the ability to test your CI/CD pipeline, you might need Docker, right? So running your full CI tools in Docker to kind of test or test any scripts that you've built or generated is just hugely beneficial. So one of the problems I've run into on teams is we've gone ahead and they've got like a Jenkins instance, Circle CI, GitLab, whatever your flavor is of infrastructure, and you write these scripts. Like with Jenkins, you can create a Jenkins file. GitLab uses a YAML file. GitHub Actions, they use YAML files, right? And you can write this and you have no way to test it until you actually go out to deploy for real. What would be nice is if you had a tool like Docker that can set up a Circle CI, a Jenkins, a GitLab environment, whatever you need, that you can actually execute your tests in. And this even, again, builds off those CLI tools that we talked about in the last slide. Because if we can control the versions that we're actually deploying out into these Docker containers, similarly, we can emulate or mirror the actual build environment and get real world feedback a lot faster. And we don't have to risk a production environment being manipulated or modified accidentally.
All right, if you need to host your app in a container, cloud deployments, very, very common runtime for all deployments. It doesn't matter if you're running it on Mac, Linux, Windows, it's going to be the same runtime, right? You're going to have the same everything. So if it works on your machine, it will work in the cloud. You're going to have less OS dependent issues. So different bindings for Mac versus Windows users, that's becoming less of a problem because you're running in that common runtime.
Yeah. And so if you need to set up a whole app ecosystem as well, you might need Docker. So if you want to run all the things together, like we mentioned before, with an orchestration through a compose, right? We could set up multiple database environments that we might have for our application ecosystem. We could set up multiple other applications that we even have for our application system. And we can stand up it all locally in these Dockerized containers, and we can test to make sure that our application interacts with each one of these components effectively before we deploy it out into a real world environment or even a production environment. So we can get that real world feedback really, really quickly. And even for some of the things we don't usually test is like log aggregation or metrics, right? Well, if we stand an elk stack up, for instance, in a Docker container, we can really see that our logs are correctly flowing to our elk stack, our Elasticsearch Logstash and Kibana layer. But we could stand up, other applications too, right? We could stand up local stack for AWS resources to be emulated inside of Docker containers. So if we want to make sure our Lambda code got deployed out into a Lambda using Docker, we've got it available. If we want to make sure our Lambda Docker can communicate with a Docker S3 instance, which is AWS's file storage system, we can make sure they all interact correctly once we deploy it in an AWS-like environment through Docker. And other local ecosystems, we could stand up things like Grafana too, and see how all of that is playing out and see that we're getting metrics flowing through and generated.
All right, and now if you're considering Kubernetes, don't, unless you have a valid high scalability use case where other scaling options won't really work.
Right.
Kubernetes is very complicated to manage, very complicated, a lot of overhead in learning. It's its own entire ecosystem. There are ways you can get scaling without using Kubernetes that will be a lot simpler for you to manage. And then, hey, maybe after you hit your pains with that, decide Kubernetes might be a thing you need. That might be when you look into it. But initially, you probably don't need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Usually it's meant to solve high scale problems that are in the millions of simultaneous or concurrent requests. And if you don't have millions of simultaneous concurrent requests, it's probably trying to use a sledgehammer to pound a nail into a 2x4, right? It'll work, but it'll probably do some damage too in the meantime. So, all right. And that's the end of the slide deck. I think we still got like 4-ish minutes here. Figured we could open the floor up to any questions anybody might have.
I was going to say, this is tangentially related. But
Yeah.
if you weren't going to use Kubernetes, if that was overkill, what would you use instead?
There's lots of different things you can use. We mentioned application hosting through like a cloud solution. So AWS has tools like Fargate, or you could use their EC2 instances, and you could just host a Dockerized container in there, and you could set it behind a load balancer and have multiple instances of your container images that will scale up to meet that demand. So you can still use containers. You can still build your infrastructure around containers, but you can much more tightly manage it instead of having to worry about a Kubernetes cluster building up to scale it to meet the demand. And we could still have a load balancer, so we can still, of course, distribute load across multiple containers.
Yeah, and the other thing to note is for like local development, if you're getting started, you can use Docker Compose to orchestrate your services if you have a back end and a front end.
Yes.
And like Fargate and ECS, if you actually look at their services YAML file, it's very similar constructed to a Docker Compose file. And even if you have to go to Kubernetes, nobody actually uses Kubernetes raw. They use a Helm chart or something else, which is again a definition of your services and how they relate to each other.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great question too. Any other questions out there on some use cases of Docker? Like I said, we're not covering every example of when Docker might be beneficial. These are just some of the most high level or low hanging fruit ones that you can grab that provide benefit very quickly to a team and require mostly minimal intervention to set up on the team's behalf.
I did have a question. Maybe times where Docker isn't as strong, and maybe it's gotten better since then, but I remember having the dream of it being a development environment, and I've had nothing but pain, especially watching file changes. It's been a nightmare.
Yeah, who is this? I don't know the voice.
Tilly.
Kylie. Yeah, nice to meet you, Kylie. So early on, some troubles we had was, well, Docker didn't play very well with Windows, right? So I remember working on a client team where we had a MongoDB instance and we had to do a local MongoDB install. We all had to become experts as to cleaning up the DLLs and the configuration files, because it was not uncommon for our local install to get into a bad state. Docker would have saved us a lot of heartache and trouble, especially now that it plays a lot nicer with Windows. And with the Windows subsystem for Linux, so the WSL, getting better integration of Windows, I suspect it'll become smoother. But to your point, when doesn't it work so well? I have had issues with installing client-based applications that we wanted to host out in the cloud. And the problem was that those client-based installers use a GUI and there was no silent install option. That's going to make things pretty darn challenging for a Dockerized container, right? So things like that might be pretty challenging for you and might not provide a lot of benefit. Setting up a whole development ecosystem might not provide as much benefit to teams, especially if you're developing inside of an editor, and you could certainly put like Maven in there, but if you're doing builds constantly on your machine, it may or may not provide the benefits you're seeking. So it's going to be a judgment call, because there is complexity to set it up. And I think it's easier to target those low-hanging fruit options first. And if it makes sense to expand beyond that, then look into it.
Though it is to note, the integrations by the IDEs is getting much better for Docker.
Yes.
You are able to point at different Docker containers for different reasons in certain IDEs. So explore what your IDE has to offer with Docker availability. You might be able to target that for your build tooling. But always something to play with there and look around. Things are always changing with that, so try to stay up to date with it.
Nice.
Great question, Kylie. Anybody else? We're right at time though, so. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for dropping in for this really quick 15-minute presentation on you might need Docker if.
Yeah, just one, thanks Alex and John for covering all that. Just one quick call out. We do have the next Lean BYTES scheduled, and that will be with Tim Gifford going over coding standards. So he'll be covering that here in 2 weeks. But if, like I said, if you are interested in giving a Lean BYTES presentation, just don't hesitate to reach out and we can get you on the schedule. Other than that, have a good Tuesday, everybody. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks.
Good job.
See ya.